Welcome to This Explainer. We hear absolutely everything about trillion-dollar tech companies, right? The brilliant chip architectures, the incredible AI revolution. But underneath it all, there's a hidden and, frankly, surprisingly fragile foundation.
Let's just dive right into this stark reality. No gas, no chip. It really is that simple. If unseen, highly specialized factories don't manage to capture and deliver these super precise gases, the production of practically every modern technology, we're talking everything from fighter jets and life-saving medical imaging, all the way down to the ChatGPT on your smartphone, literally just stops dead in its tracks. Every single chip powering every massive data center out there depends entirely on these quiet, unglamorous exhaust inputs.
And to make this work, well, it requires impossible purity. Look at this number, 99.9999%. And honestly, a lot of the time the required purity is even better than that. When you're manufacturing a modern semiconductor, you've got lasers carving billions of switches at the width of just a few atoms. At that microscopic scale, a single errant molecule of a different element is like a boulder on a highway. It causes a microscopic defect that ruins the entire chip. So you can't just use any off-the-shelf gas. It has to be refined to a level of perfection that's almost hard to wrap your head around. Think of building these chips as essentially a process of drawing with light and carving with plasma, layer by microscopic layer. First off, neon feeds the lasers that actually print those incredibly intricate patterns right onto the silicon wafer. Next, gases like xenon and krypton step in to etch those impossibly fine structures into the chip itself. And finally, tungsten hexafluoride, or WF6, lays down the tiny metal wires that connect billions of transistors together. Every single step demands its specific, perfectly refined gas.
Which brings us to a massive, almost kind of funny irony in our modern economy. The futuristic, trillion-dollar AI revolution, the one housed in those pristine, ultra-clean fabrication plants, is invisibly chained to centuries-old heavy metal and dirt. You can't just easily stand up a factory to make these gases from scratch. They are largely captured as mere byproducts from the exhaust of gritty steel mills and chemical plants. It's the ultimate contrast, right? The immaculate AI revolution is completely tethered to heavy metal, oxygen production, and industrial fire.
Now, as you might guess, this creates a terrifyingly fragile supply chain. Let's look back to early 2022. The entire world's supply of chip-grade neon was sitting almost entirely in one basket. Just two plants in Ukraine, companies named Ingus and Cryowin, produced around half of the world's total supply. And this was almost accidental. It was basically a byproduct of Ukraine's Soviet-era steel industry perfecting the purification process over the decades. But it created a massive reliance. Prior to 2022, the United States relied on Ukraine for an estimated 90% of its chip-grade neon supply. 90%.
That fragility was violently exposed when Russia invaded Ukraine. In March 2022, those two crucial plants shut down. Instantly, poof, half the world's supply vanished. The price of high-purity neon didn't just tick up, it absolutely exploded by 500 to 600%. For a very tense period, the world's fabrication plants had to nervously survive on their stockpiles. The entire tech industry was scrambling for alternatives, staring down the very real, very scary possibility that a single war could throttle the production of the advanced chips needed across the globe.
But you know, when a choke point opens up, someone always steps through it. China rapidly utilized its massive fleet of air separation units to fill that void, holding over 40% of the world's global air separation capacity, which is the very machinery needed to capture neon, krypton, and xenon as byproducts of steelmaking. Chinese producers scaled up their purification processes incredibly fast following that 2022 shock. They essentially transformed from being just one of several suppliers into the dominant, self-reliant supplier of these critical noble gases.
Naturally, the West aggressively talked about diversification to prevent another crisis. And to be fair, real efforts were made. $250 million was invested into a massive new neon plant in Texas. Efforts were launched to develop helium fields in Canada and Australia. The Gulf states even started studying how to capture rare gases directly from the atmosphere and their massive refineries. But despite all these millions of dollars in strategic plans, well, talk is slower than concrete. Ultimately, the fundamental market concentration barely shifted. The dependency just kind of moved from one geography to another.
Which brings us to a really critical date. Fast forward to just a few weeks ago, on July 1st, 2026, a second major shock hit the semiconductor industry. And it proved a hard lesson. A choke point you don't permanently fix is a choke point you will inevitably feel again. While everyone was watching neon,
A different but equally vital gas suddenly dried up, sending shockwaves right back through those very same fragile supply chains.
The culprit this time? Tungsten hexafluoride, or WF6. As we established earlier, this is an absolutely irreplaceable specialty gas. It is mandatory for laying down the microscopic tungsten wiring inside leading-edge logic chips, high-bandwidth memory, and the 3D flash storage that this current AI boom entirely relies upon. Out of nowhere, two Japanese companies that collectively produced a full quarter of the world's supply of WF6 suddenly announced they were permanently ceasing production.
The fallout was immediate, and it was severe. Because of these sudden, permanent closures on July 1st, the price of WF6 has already surged more than 200% in just a single year. But what's more alarming? Industry analysts estimate a terrifying 2,000-ton supply gap is opening up right now in the second half of 2026. Guys, this isn't some future theoretical problem. It's a massive hole in the supply of a gas that the advanced chip industry simply cannot function without today.
This whole situation is a masterclass in supply chain vulnerability. Let's trace it back. Those Japanese plants didn't shut down for a lack of customers, right? They shut off because China tightened exports of high-purity tungsten powder. That powder is the core raw feedstock required to make tungsten hexafluoride. Starved of this vital raw material, a quarter of the world's WF6 capacity simply had no choice but to switch off, instantly leaving global fabs facing these catastrophic shortages.
And this really highlights the defining feature of the new global chip conflict. You don't need to ban chips to hurt chip making. There's a new rule in town. One control creates many choke points. A country can restrict a mineral way up the supply chain, like tungsten powder. That squeeze travels downstream to starve a specialty gas plant in Japan. And finally, that squeeze travels even further downstream, ultimately creating a massive choke point inside every leading-edge fabrication plant on the planet. The pressure just travels all the way down.
The industry is definitely waking up to the fact that basic fluorine chemistry costs have climbed 2 to 3 times over. Governments are now treating this entirely as a matter of national security, and defensive strategies are shifting fast. We're seeing aggressive stockpiling of gas reserves to create buffers measured in months, essentially buying time instead of triggering immediate panic. We're seeing direct funding for domestic capture at local steel mills, and crucially, we're seeing meticulous mapping of the supply chain, gas by gas, plant by plant, desperately trying to find the next hidden vulnerability before it gets exposed.
As we wrap up this explainer, consider the true lesson of neon and tungsten hexafluoride. We talk about the chip race as a battle of trillion-dollar machines and brilliant engineers, but the greatest vulnerability was never the famous fabs themselves. It was always the quiet, unglamorous ex-host inputs that almost nobody was watching. The entire foundation of modern computing relies on a few fragile factories and steel cylinders shipped across a very nervous world. So consider this. Will the entire age of artificial intelligence ultimately be held hostage by a handful of fragile factories?